A 6-year-old child huddled in the snow, trembling with the inverted algi's rune burned into her wrist, the symbol of death. Blood slowly trickled down her pale skin as snowflakes fell around her. No one heard her silent cry that night, not even the gods who had turned their backs on her. Thank you for joining this journey into a forgotten corner of Viking life. Our channel is just beginning to unfold these stories of struggle, faith, and the human spirit beneath the cold skies of the North. If you find value in these tales, please consider subscribing. It truly helps us grow toward our first 1,000 followers and keeps this project alive. And please share in the comments where you're watching from. Your presence means more than words can say. The pale light of dawn was swallowed by thick gray clouds, heavy with the promise of snow. The stillness of the frozen fjord was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a lone raven circling above the jagged cliffs. The wind howled like a restless spirit through the skeletal branches of frost-covered pines, whispering tales of hardship and loss to those who cared to listen. Beneath this somber sky, the village of Helgavik lay nestled against the rocky shore, its wooden huts half buried in snowdrifts, smoke rising thin and bluish from chimneys like fragile prayers to the gods. Ragnar Thorvaldsson stood alone on the edge of the harbor, his broad frame wrapped tightly in layers of thick wool and furs. The bitter cold bit through the seams of his leather gloves, numbing his fingers even as he clenched his fists to keep warm. His breath came out in ragged clouds, mingling with the mist that rolled off the icy fjord. Each gust sent shards of frost stinging his weathered face, carving sharper the lines drawn there by years of battle and bitter winters. His red hair, tangled and streaked with ice, clung stubbornly to his scalp beneath a worn leather cap. The deep blue of his eyes scanned the horizon, reflecting the merciless gray sea and the looming ice cliffs beyond. At 32, Ragnar carried the weight of his clan's hopes and fears on his broad shoulders. As the guardian of the harbor and a seasoned warrior of the Ravenshield clan, his days were a steady rhythm of vigilance and toil, preparing defenses, maintaining the boats, overseeing the unloading of supplies that arrived precariously during brief thaws. But beneath the surface of his stoic exterior simmered a restless unrest. The early arrival of winter this year had tipped the delicate balance of survival in their isolated settlement. Food stores were dwindling, the hunt had been poor, and whispers of hardship and sacrifice grew louder with each frozen night. The wind tore at the fur lining his cloak, carrying with it scents of salt and pine, smoke and old wood. The familiar creak of boats anchored at the dock mingled with the soft crunch of snow under heavy boots. Nearby, the blacksmith's forge glowed faintly, a beacon of warmth in the endless cold. Ragnar's eyes lingered on the smoke curling from its chimney, a rare comfort in the endless gray. His gaze shifted to the sea, where ice floes drifted like spectral messengers from a distant, colder world. The fjord was his domain, a place where every wave and storm was a test of endurance. He had known the sea's cruelty, the loss of friends swallowed by its depths, the whisper of death carried on its waves. Those memories haunted the lines of his face, carved deeper than any scar. A sudden movement caught his eye. From the shadows near the forge stepped Leif, the blacksmith's eldest son, his breath steaming in the cold air. His youthful face was pale, edged with worry. "Thorvaldsson," Leif called out, lifting his hand to shield his eyes against the wind. "My father requests your presence at the forge. There's something you need to see." Ragnar nodded once, his shoulders stiffening. Duty called as always. He turned away from the water and made his way across the snow-packed ground, the crunch of his boots muffled against the soft blanket of new snow. The village was waking slowly. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the muffled sounds of morning chores filtered through the crisp air. Women stirred fire pits, children huddled near the longhouse, and men sharpened axes and checked weapons by the fading light. The forge was a stark contrast to the bleakness of the day. Its walls were blackened by smoke and soot, the air dense with the scent of burning charcoal and molten metal. Sparks flew as Halvar, the clan's grizzled blacksmith, hammered rhythmically against a glowing blade, the clang resonating like a heartbeat in the small space. His hands moved with practiced precision, hardened by decades of labor, each strike sending ripples of heat that pushed back the cold. Halvar's face was coarse and bronzed, his beard long and streaked with gray, braided loosely over his chest. His eyes, though shadowed by age, held a sharpness that belied his years. When he noticed Ragnar, he paused, wiping sweat and soot from his brow with a heavy leather arm. "Ragnar," he greeted, voice low but urgent. "Come, there's something you must see." Ragnar stepped further inside, the warmth pressing against his chilled skin. In a dim corner of the forge, something unusual caught his eye. A small, curled figure huddled between sacks of coal and tools, barely moving. The child's dark hair spilled messily over pale cheeks, her tiny frame trembling beneath a threadbare woolen dress. Her gray eyes, wide and wary, flicked toward him with a guarded intensity that seemed far beyond her years. Halvar knelt carefully beside her, not daring to make sudden movements. "Found her here this morning," he said quietly. "She won't speak. No one knows where she came from." Ragnar's heart tightened as he looked closer. The child's wrist was marked with a dark symbol, an inverted ajudar rune, etched into her skin with a cruel precision that betrayed fire's bite. The blood oozed slowly, staining the pale flesh beneath. The sight made Ragnar's breath hitch. The death rune, a mark he had only heard whispered in the oldest tales and dreaded stories told by weary travelers. A sign that the gods had claimed her, a symbol of sacrifice and doom. "By the gods," Ragnar muttered, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you understand what this means, Halvar?" Halvar nodded grimly. She was marked for sacrifice, likely fled from some ceremony before dawn. The priests, they don't always choose willingly, especially in times like these. Ragnar's eyes lingered on the girl. Fear was there, but beneath it something else, a stubborn flicker of defiance, fragile yet unwavering. Her gaze held a silent plea, a quiet hope that refused to be extinguished despite the shadow looming over her. Memories surged unbidden, his daughter Sigrid's face, her laughter lost to the same bitter winter 3 years before. The void left by her absence was a wound still raw, a silence that echoed through the empty corners of his home. "This child," Ragnar breathed. "To shelter her is to invite the wrath of the gods and the scorn of the clan." Halvar's eyes met his. "And yet, you hesitate. What will you do?" The forge's heat seemed to pulse between them, a crucible of choice and consequence. Ragnar swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling deep into his bones. "I will take her to my cabin. For now, no one must know." The old blacksmith's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded in reluctant agreement. Outside, the wind had sharpened into a keen edge. Ragnar wrapped the girl in his fur cloak, careful to shield the mark from prying eyes. She trembled, but did not resist, her gaze fixed on the harsh landscape beyond the forge. As they moved through the village, the faint murmur of morning prayers rose from the longhouse, a reminder of the unyielding grip of faith and tradition. The villagers carried on their routines, unaware of the fragile life cradled in Ragnar's arms, marked by death yet burning with untold secrets. The path to his cabin was treacherous, threads of ice hidden beneath the snow, each step a cautious negotiation with the frozen earth. The small dwelling sat at the edge of the settlement, solitary against the vast expanse of wilderness beyond. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, promising warmth and shelter amidst the gathering storm. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood and worn leather. Ragnar set the girl down gently beside the hearth, where embers glowed faintly beneath a bed of ashes. He stoked the fire, the flames flaring to life, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn wall. Outside, the village stirred to life under the heavy sky. The sound of children's laughter briefly echoed across the courtyard, a fragile reminder of innocence in a harsh land. But for Hilda, the child wrapped in furs beside the fire, innocence was a fragile thread stretched thin by shadows. The coming days promised only deeper frost and darker tests. Ragnar knew that the quiet before the storm was slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of a world where loyalty, faith, and survival collided in brutal conflict. Yet, beneath the weight of tradition and fear, something fragile and fierce was beginning to take root, a bond forged not by blood, but by the shared defiance of a man and a child bound by fate. Outside, the wind gathered strength, howling through the trees like a warning cry. The gods might have turned their backs, but Ragnar's resolve burned steadily, a beacon against the encroaching night. Ragnar's heavy breath clouded in the cold air as he stood by the forge's dim corner, eyes locked on the frail figure huddled between sacks of coal. The girl's small body seemed fragile, almost swallowed by the coarse wool of her dress. Her raven-black hair fell in tangled strands, framing a face too pale, too delicate for the cruel world she now inhabited. Yet, in those wide, wary gray eyes, there was something that reached beyond mere fear, a quiet resistance, a flicker of life that refused to be snuffed out. He shifted uncomfortably, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily upon him. The firelight flickered against the soot-darkened walls, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Around him, the forge echoed with the rhythm of Halvar's hammer strikes, but the sound felt distant as the gods themselves seemed from this moment. For a long moment, Ragnar said nothing. The silence hung thick, broken only by the faint drip of blood from the girl's wrist, where the inverted ajudar rune burned cruelly into her skin. The sight of that mark, the death rune, chilled his blood deeper than the winter wind ever could. It was a symbol that carried the weight of doom, a mark carved in fire and fear by those who wielded tradition like a weapon. "Who marked you?" he wanted to ask, but the words caught in his throat. How could she speak of such horror, when even the gods had seemingly turned their backs on her? Halvar's voice pulled him back. "She won't say where she comes from. Not yet. But I found her before the sun rose, hiding here all alone." The blacksmith's eyes were heavy with sorrow. "I've seen too many winters. Too many lost children. This one, she's different." Ragnar knelt slowly, bringing his gaze level with the child's. He wanted to reach out, to offer warmth and safety, but something restrained him. The heavy shadow of the rune, the weight of his clan's laws, the unyielding expectations of his people. And yet, the ache in his chest grew, a hollow space carved by memories of Sigrid, his own daughter, stolen by the merciless frost 3 winters past. "You're safe here," he said, voice low and steady, hoping to bridge the vast gulf between them. "No one will harm you." The girl's eyes flickered with a faint glimmer of hope, but still she remained silent, retreating further into herself as if mistrust was her only shield. Ragnar could feel the ache of that distrust, a wound deeper than any scar etched by blade or flame. He glanced back at Halvar, whose weathered face was unreadable. "What do you think? Should we take her to the Volva? The old seer might understand." Halvar shook his head slowly. "The Volva is wise, but she is bound to the old ways. If she sees the mark, she might send the girl to the altar. The gods demand their due, especially when the signs are clear." Ragnar's jaw tightened. The thought of handing this fragile child back to the merciless rites made his blood boil. This was not just a child marked for death. To surrender her now was to betray everything he had fought for, the memories of those lost, the hope that something better might still exist. He swallowed hard, the fire's warmth doing little to thaw the cold not forming in his chest. "I can't let them have her," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. "Not like this. Not again." Halvar's eyes met his, a mixture of respect and worry. You know the risk, Thorvaldsson. To challenge the gods, to defy the Jarl's decree, it is to invite ruin upon yourself. Ragnar's gaze dropped to the girl once more. Her trembling frame, her haunted eyes, they spoke of a story untold, a cruel fate escaped, and a fragile hope kindled against the darkness. The burden of choice pressed down on him, but beneath the weight, a fierce resolve began to kindle. I will take her to my home, he said, voice firm. No one must know, not yet. I will protect her. The blacksmith nodded slowly, the firelight catching the lines of age and hardship etched in his face. Then we must be careful. The Jarl's eyes are everywhere. As Ragnar moved closer, the girl flinched instinctively. His hand hovered uncertainly before he reached out, covering her small wrist with his rough palm. The skin was icy cold beneath his touch, the rune's dark marks stark against the pale flesh. Do you have a name? He asked softly, hoping to coax a fragment of trust. Her eyes met his, hesitant, searching. Then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered a single word, Hilda. There was a profound weight to her name, fragile yet steadfast in the quiet forge. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fall away. The clang of metal, the biting cold, the looming shadows of gods and men. All that remained was this small, marked child who clung to life amidst the ruin. Ragnar wrapped her carefully in his fur cloak, shielding the cursed mark from prying eyes. The cold bit deep as they stepped back into the gray dawn, the wind carrying whispers of forgotten prayers and silent pleas. Each step toward his solitary cabin at the edge of the village was a step into defiance, a challenge to fate itself. Inside his modest home, the fire crackled to life, casting a fragile glow that seemed to ward off the encroaching darkness. Ragnar set Hilda down gently beside the hearth, watching as the warmth slowly seeped into her trembling form. He fetched a carved drinking horn, filling it with warm goat's milk sweetened with honey, simple comforts once offered to his own lost daughter. Hilda's hesitant hands closed around the horn, and as she drank, a fragile trust began to take root. Ragnar settled nearby, eyes never leaving her small form. The silence between them was heavy but no longer filled with fear. It held the first fragile thread of connection. As night deepened outside, the howling wind and the distant cries of ravens seemed to echo the turmoil within Ragnar's heart. The gods might have turned away, the village might whisper of sacrifice and doom, but here, in this quiet cabin bathed in firelight, a man had chosen to protect a child marked for death. And in that choice, the first embers of hope flickered against the cold. The cabin sat on the edge of the settlement like a solitary sentinel, its wooden frame weathered by years of wind and snow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and damp earth, mingling with the faint trace of dry herbs hung from the rafters. The hearth's fire sputtered and flared, casting flickering shadows against the rough-hewn walls, where hunting trophies and worn shields leaned silently in their places. Ragnar moved with quiet purpose, his heavy boots creaking softly on the wooden floorboards as he carried Hilda deeper into the warmth of the shelter. She was still trembling, though the cold no longer bit through her thin dress. Wrapped loosely in his wool fur cloak, she trembled beneath the weight of quiet fear and the exhaustion of flight. Her gray eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the flickering flames, reflecting the golden light like two small mirrors holding secrets too heavy for a child's soul. Her pale skin, almost translucent in the firelight, revealed the dark, jagged mark branded into her wrist, the inverted Algi's rune that had sealed her fate. Ragnar lowered her gently onto a bed of layered pelts beside the hearth, careful not to jostle the tender skin beneath the rune. The room was sparse, but offered shelter from the biting wind and the judgmental eyes of the village. He knelt beside her, setting a carved wooden bowl and a horn filled with warm goat's milk sweetened with honey on the rough table nearby. The warmth, "Do you have a name?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, carrying the weight of a man who knew what it was to lose everything. Hilda's lips pressed together, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, fragile and cracked by disuse, she breathed, Hilda." The syllable hung in the room like a fragile promise. Ragnar nodded slowly, relief washing through him like a thaw in frozen earth. "Hilda," he repeated, the name feeling foreign yet somehow right on his tongue. She looked away, tugging the edge of her dress nervously. Her eyes drifted to the mark on her wrist, tracing the jagged lines burned into her skin, as if searching for answers in the cruel design. Ragnar followed her gaze, feeling the weight of old superstitions and the cold shadow of the runes pressed deep into the soul of the North. His fingers moved lightly, almost reverently, tracing the Vegvisor tattoo etched into his own forearm, a symbol of guidance in the darkest of storms, before he folded his hands in his lap. The contrast between himself and the child was stark, one marked by the hope of guidance, the other by the certainty of death. The fire flickered, and the shadows danced, as if the walls themselves bore witness to a fragile alliance forged not from blood but from shared defiance. Ragnar's mind raced, caught between the harsh law of the clan and the fierce hunger for mercy that gnawed at his heart. He rose slowly and moved to a low shelf where a small bundle of cloth lay folded. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a collection of herbs, some dried and some freshly gathered from the forest's edge during the last thaw. Gently, he took Hilda's wrist, inspecting the rune with a practiced eye. The skin around the mark was raw and angry, but there was no swelling or infection, a small mercy in a world that seemed bent on her destruction. From the bundle, he selected a soft cloth soaked in a bitter-smelling salve, a mixture of herbs known for their healing astringency. Carefully, he dabbed the ointment around the edges of the rune, mindful not to cause pain, whispering old words of protection that his mother had taught him in childhood. The ritual was humble, a quiet rebellion against the cruel fate imposed upon this child. Hilda flinched but did not pull away, her trust growing, slow and hesitant like the first light of dawn. The room was silent save for the crackling fire and the steady rhythm of Ragnar's breathing. He paused, catching her eye once more. In that gaze, he saw a flicker of something unexpected, not just fear, but a fragile spark of hope, a whisper of survival against the shadow of death that clung to her. He folded the cloth back into the bundle and offered her a worn piece of bread, dense and dark, the taste of barley and earth grounding her in the present. She took it slowly, biting carefully, the act small but significant, a step toward reclaiming the life that had been threatened. Hours passed in this quiet communion. Ragnar kept watch, his sword resting nearby, but forgotten for a time as he sat beside the hearth. The weight of solitude settled between them, punctuated by the occasional crackle of burning wood or the distant call of a raven. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the world in a blanket of white silence. In the flickering light, Hilda's exhaustion finally overcame her fear. Her breathing slowed, deep and even, the fragile barrier of mistrust crumbling in the warmth of the cabin. Ragnar allowed himself a brief moment of relief, watching over her as she slipped into a restless sleep, murmuring words in a language unknown to him, ancient, melodic, filled with a sorrowful beauty that unsettled even his battle-hardened heart. He settled back against the wall, eyes never leaving the pale child whose fate was intertwined with his own. The rune on her wrist seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight, a cruel reminder that the god's gaze was never far, even if their mercy was. Ragnar's thoughts drifted to the village beyond the cabin walls, the watchful eyes of Jarl Gunnar, the manipulative counsel of Eirik, and the whispered traditions that condemned Hilda before she had even spoken a word. The weight of expectation pressed heavily on him, threatening to crush the fragile hope he was beginning to nurture. Yet, in the quiet moments shared with the child, there was a promise, not of gods or runes, but of something more human and enduring. The courage to defy fate, to protect the innocent in a world that had forgotten mercy. As dawn crept slowly toward the horizon, casting a pale light through the frost-covered window, Ragnar wrapped the cloak more tightly around himself and the sleeping child. The cold wind moaned beyond the cabin walls, but inside, the fragile warmth of shelter and trust began to bloom, a fragile seed planted in the frozen earth, waiting for the spring to come. Hours later, as the day deepened and snow continued to fall, Ragnar rose quietly. He gave Hilda a moment longer before gently waking her with a soft touch on the shoulder. Her eyes fluttered open, still clouded with sleep but tinged with something new, a tentative curiosity. "Eat," he said simply, placing the remaining bread and some fresh berries on a wooden plate. The berries were tart and cold, a rare treat for the frozen season. Hilda reached out, her fingers brushing his, the contact brief but electric, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile trust building between them. She munched slowly, savoring the flavors as if discovering something long lost. Ragnar watched, noting the subtle shifts in her posture, a softening of shoulders, a lessening of the rigid fear that had held her captive. For a moment, words hung in the air, unsaid but understood. In the harsh world of Helgavik, where fate was often decided by the cruel edicts of gods and men, here was a space carved out by simple acts: warmth, food, shelter, and a quiet promise of protection. As the fire dwindled to glowing embers, Ragnar spoke again, voice low but steady. "You are safe here. For now." Hilda's eyes met his, wide and searching, as if weighing the truth in his words against the long shadow of her past. Then, in a whisper barely audible, she spoke. "Why did you save me?" Ragnar looked away briefly, the weight of his answer pressing deep. "Because no child should be marked to die." The words hung between them, fragile yet unyielding. Outside, the wind carried the distant cries of ravens, the sky heavy with snow, and the world remained unchanged. But within the small cabin, a quiet rebellion had taken root, a defiance of fate, a challenge to the gods, and the beginning of a bond that would test the limits of courage and mercy in a land ruled by death and tradition. The night deepened, and as Hilda drifted back into restless sleep, Ragnar kept watch. The rune on her wrist was a reminder of the darkness that stalked them, but in the flickering firelight, it was also a symbol of the fragile hope that flickered in the cold heart of a man who had chosen to protect a child condemned by the gods themselves. The frost clung to the village like a shroud, cold and unyielding, as the whispers traveled through Helgavik's narrow paths and snow-covered rooftops. The news of the disappearance spread swiftly, an ember fanned by suspicion and fear, igniting the scrutiny of neighbors, warriors, and even shadowed eyes from distant clans. The child marked by death had vanished from the watch of the gods and men alike, and the consequences rippled outward, threatening to engulf both Ragnar Thorvaldsson and the fragile bond he sought to protect. At the forge, Halvar's heavy hands trembled ever so slightly as he hammered iron, the rhythmic clang failing to drown the uneasy murmurs that had begun to echo through the settlement. The blacksmith's usually steady gaze flicked toward the cabin edge where Ragnar had taken the child. Each whispered question from the village was a blade inching closer to the heart of their fragile sanctuary. "Did you hear?" a voice hissed in the shadowed corner of the hall. "The Jarl's men searched the forge at dawn. They found nothing, but they know someone hides her." Another voice murmured, "It's blasphemy to shelter a marked child. The gods demand sacrifice. What does it say if we let this defiance stand?" Halvar's brow furrowed beneath his soot-darkened skin. "We are caught between the gods and the wrath of men," he muttered, the weight of his own loss heavy in his voice. Outside, the biting wind carried the sound of heavy boots crunching through fresh. The gods show their favor through signs, Astrid said softly, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. But they also test us through hardship. Perhaps this is such a test. Eirik scoffed. Tests do not defy the Jarl's commands. This is rebellion, dressed in mercy. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the crackling fire. Gunnar's jaw tightened. Then prepare the men. Find Thorvaldsson and the child. Bring them before me. Outside the longhouse, the air was thick with unease. The villagers, bound by tradition and fear, grappled with their own uncertainties. Some whispered prayers to Odin and Freya, seeking guidance. Others sharpened blades, ready to uphold the clan's honor, even if it meant tearing apart the fragile thread between man and child. Ragnar sensed the storm gathering, not just the winter's howling cold, but the gathering fury of a people desperate to cling to their old ways. He had hoped to shield Hilda from this, but now the walls of their refuge felt thin, vulnerable to the relentless tide. Inside his cabin, Hilda sat by the hearth, her small hands tracing the grain of the wooden table. The inverted algi's rune on her wrist itched beneath the thin veil of healing salves, a cruel reminder of the fate the gods had marked upon her. Her gray eyes, once filled with fragile hope, now mirrored the darkening skies outside. Ragnar sat beside her, his broad hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a silent promise of protection. Yet beneath his calm exterior, his thoughts churned with dread. He knew the village would not rest until the debt had been paid, until the sacrifice was complete, or until the defiance was crushed. That evening, the silence was shattered by a cautious knock at the door. Ragnar's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword as he approached. Through the frosted glass, he saw the familiar, weathered face of Halvar. "Trouble comes," the blacksmith whispered, stepping inside quickly. "They are gathering men, warriors from the village and strangers from beyond Helgevik's borders. News spreads like wildfire. Some say the neighboring clan of Skjoldr hears of the defiance and watches with hungry eyes." Ragnar's eyes narrowed. The Skjoldr were fierce and proud, and their arrival would tip the delicate balance from tension to outright conflict. "We cannot hold out forever," Ragnar said grimly. "They will come for her, and for me." Halvar nodded, setting down a small bundle of provisions by the fire. "I brought what you asked, a knife forged from the iron of the mountain's heart, and smoked herring for the journey. There is a skiff hidden beneath the ice in the fisherman's cove. If you choose to flee, now is the time." Ragnar's gaze met Hilda's. The child's expression was resolute, the fear tempered by a quiet strength. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She looked up, her voice steady despite her youth. "I will go wherever you lead me." The decision hung heavy between them, a crossroads where loyalty to kin and the call of conscience clashed. To protect Hilda was to turn his back on the village and the gods they worshipped. To stay was to risk the ruin of all he held dear. Outside, the first snow of the coming storm began to fall, dusting the world in silence. Ragnar knew that soon the village guards would come, torches raised and weapons drawn, seeking the child marked by death and the man who dared defy them. At dawn, the village stirred with an urgency born of fear. Warriors gathered at the longhouse, faces set in grim determination, their breath visible in the icy air. Among them were men who had fought beside Ragnar in past battles, now torn between loyalty to their leader and obedience to the Jarl. Leif, the blacksmith's son, approached Ragnar with a conflicted look. "Ragnar, my father says you're a fool to protect her. But I believe in what you do. I will stand with you, even if it costs me everything." Ragnar's chest tightened at the young man's words. Trust was scarce, and allies fewer still. Together, they moved swiftly through the village, gathering what provisions they could: furs, dried meat, water skins. The weight of every step was heavy with the knowledge that the world they knew was slipping away. As they reached the fisherman's cove, the skiff lay beneath a thin layer of ice, hidden from the prying eyes of the village guards. Ragnar's hands worked quickly, breaking the ice and pushing the boat into the dark waters of the fjord. Hilda climbed in without hesitation, her small form dwarfed by the wooden vessel. The wind howled through the narrow fjord as Ragnar took the oars, each stroke a defiance against the gathering darkness. Behind them, the crooked shapes of Helgevik's rooftops faded into the gray horizon, swallowed by snow and shadow. But the danger was far from over. From the cliffs above, a group of men watched, scouts sent by the Jarl, their faces grim beneath fur-lined helmets. One raised a horn to his lips, the sharp call carrying over the frozen water. The hunt had begun. Ragnar's heart pounded in his chest as he rode tirelessly, the cold seeping into his bones, but his resolve unbroken. Hilda sat wrapped in furs, clutching the wooden raven amulet close, the symbol of protection and hope against the cruel fate etched into her skin. The fjord stretched endlessly ahead, a vast expanse of cold and uncertainty. Behind them, the village, and all that had been, slipped quietly beneath the veil of snow. Ahead lay the unknown. Ragnar's thoughts flickered to the stories of old. Heroes who faced gods and monsters, who carved their fate with steel and will. But this was no legend. This was survival, raw and unyielding. The gods may have turned away, but men still held the power to choose. And Ragnar Thorvaldsson chose to fight. For the child, for the hope that no mark of death could truly bind his soul. The night deepened, and the small boat cut through the dark waters like a desperate prayer carried on the wind. Somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the reach of gods and men, a new story was beginning to unfold, one born not of sacrifice, but of courage. The dark secret of the Viking child marked by the death rune was no longer hidden in silence. It was a call to defiance. The chill of dawn seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls of Ragnar's cabin, carrying with it a silent warning. Outside, the snow lay thick and unbroken, swallowing the footprints that led from the village to this isolated refuge. But the stillness was deceiving. The storm gathering within the hearts of men was far fiercer than any winter gale. Inside, Ragnar sat motionless, his blue eyes narrowing as he listened to the distant sounds. The crunch of boots on snow, the low murmur of voices hard with purpose. They were coming. The Jarl's men, loyal warriors armed with steel and belief, were closing in to claim the child marked by death. A child he had sworn to protect. Hilda sat near the fire, her small hands trembling as she traced the worn wooden raven at her neck, an amulet carved by Ragnar's own hands. The flickering flames cast shadows across her pale face, highlighting the sharp angles of a child who had seen too much. Her gray eyes met Ragnar's, steady and unyielding. They shared a silence thick with fear and courage, two souls tethered by the fragile thread of hope against an unforgiving world. The door creaked, and Ragnar's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. But it was Halvar, the blacksmith, who stepped inside, his grizzled face etched with worry. "They are close, Thorvaldsson," Halvar whispered, his voice low like the rumble of distant thunder. "Jarl Gunnar leads them himself, and Eirik Haraldsson is there, his eyes burning with the fire of vengeance. They will not leave without the child." Ragnar's jaw tightened. He had expected no less. Gunnar, the Jarl, bore the weight of tradition like a stone upon his chest. His green eyes, cold and calculating, had long held the resolve to sacrifice anything for the survival of the clan, even its own innocence. And Eirik, the shadow behind the throne, manipulated that resolve with cunning words and whispered fears. Together, they were a storm far stronger than the winter raging outside. "They come to judge me," Ragnar said quietly, the words tasting bitter. "To brand me a traitor for my mercy." Halvar nodded, stepping closer to lay a heavy hand on Ragnar's shoulder. "Then we face the storm, as we have faced all others. Together." The sound of footsteps grew louder, the voices sharper. Outside, the snowburst seemed to pause, as if the land itself held its breath for what was to come. Ragnar rose, the weight of his sword familiar in his hand. He moved to the door, opening it just enough to see the figures standing in the swirling gray dawn. Jarl Gunnar stood at the front, his fur-lined cloak dusted with snow, his face stern and unforgiving. Behind him, four warriors flanked the imposing silhouette, while Eirik lingered slightly apart, his dark eyes fixed on Ragnar with cold satisfaction. Thorvaldsson, a murmur rippled through the gathered men. Some shifted uneasily, doubt flickering in their eyes. Still, the weight of law pressed heavily on their souls. Gunnar raised his hand, silencing them. Enough. You will surrender the child, or face the judgment of the clan. Ragnar felt Hilda's small hand grip his tightly. The moment stretched thin, a fragile thread over a precipice. Then, with a resolve born of all he had lost, and all he still hoped to protect, he lifted his sword. Then I will not surrender her, he said. I will fight to my last breath before I allow this injustice. The warriors surged forward, but Ragnar was ready. Years of battle had honed his reflexes. Each movement was precise, a dance of steel and survival. The first warrior lunged, but Ragnar's blade met his with a crushing blow that sent him sprawling into the snow. Another came from the side, slashing at Ragnar's arm, but he parried, the cold steel biting into his leather glove. The fight was brutal but measured. Ragnar fought not to kill, but to defend, to protect the fragile life beside him. His breath came in ragged bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs, but his spirit burned hotter than any flame. Behind the chaos, Gunnar barked orders, his green eyes blazing with fury. Eirik, ever the shadow, moved stealthily, seeking a moment to strike. Amid the clash, Hilda crouched near the cabin wall, her eyes wide with terror and determination. She traced runes in the snow with a trembling finger, words from a forgotten language spilling silently from her lips. The chill of the death rune at her wrist seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a silent cry that even the gods could not ignore. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tumult, the unmistakable tone of Astrid, the Volva, rising like a chant over the din. Stop! The warriors faltered, weapons raised cautiously as the ancient woman stepped into the clearing. Her white hair billowed like a cloud, and her eyes, though clouded, pierced the gathering storm with an unyielding strength. Enough blood has been spilled this day, she proclaimed, her voice both fragile and commanding. The gods speak not through sacrifice alone, but through courage and truth. This child is not marked for death, but for survival. The runes have been twisted by fear and lies. Gunnar's brow furrowed, disbelief warring with the respect he held for the seer. You speak dangerously, Astrid. What proof do you offer? The Volva stepped closer to Hilda, laying her gnarled hand gently on the child's wrist. The mark, once fierce and blackened, began to fade, revealing only faint traces beneath. See for yourselves, Astrid urged. The mark was painted with ink, not burned by fire. A false rune, created to deceive and control. Eirik's face paled, his mask of confidence slipping. This is treason, he hissed, drawing a dagger from his belt. Before anyone could react, a shadow moved, swift and silent. Ragnar intercepted the blow, a steel flash stopping the thrust mere inches from his chest. The moment shattered the delicate balance. Warriors tensed, weapons ready, but Astrid raised her hand once more. Eirik has spoken lies to the Jarl, poisoning his mind with fear and greed. He sought to control by bloodshed, to rule through terror. His death will bring truth to light. The crowd gasped as a figure lying at the temple entrance was revealed. Eirik Haraldsson, dagger embedded in his chest, the life fading from his pale face. Gunnar's expression twisted in shock and fury, but the weight of betrayal was undeniable. Ragnar stepped forward, holding Hilda close. This child is innocent. We have been misled by those who seek power, not by the gods who watch over us. Astrid's gaze softened as she looked at the pair. The gods test us, warrior, and you have passed, not by the strength of your arm alone, but by the courage of your heart. The tension that had gripped the village like iron slowly began to unravel. Warriors lowered their weapons, doubt and relief mingling in their eyes. Gunnar's voice was hoarse as he spoke. Then what is to be done? How do we atone for the wrongs done in the name of tradition? Astrid's eyes shone with ancient wisdom. Protect her. Protect the hope she carries. Let this be the beginning of a new path, where fear does not rule and sacrifice is not demanded by those who wield power. Ragnar looked down at Hilda, her small face illuminated by the rising sun, fragile but unbroken. The weight of the future settled upon him, no longer just a warrior, but a guardian of change. That day, the village of Helgavik stood at a crossroads. The shadows of old gods and old fears whispered still, but a new dawn was breaking, one forged by defiance, mercy, and the unyielding courage of a man who dared to challenge fate itself. As the sun climbed higher, Ragnar and Hilda prepared to leave the village that had once threatened to consume them. Halvor's words echoed in his mind. The skiff hidden among the ice, a passage to the unknown. Where will we go? Hilda asked quietly, her voice a soft thread amidst the vast silence. East, Ragnar answered, his gaze steady. To a place where no child is marked for death. Where we can build something new, not ruled by gods or fear, but by the strength of those who choose to protect. Hilda clutched the wooden raven amulet, a symbol of guidance and protection. Will you be my father now? Ragnar felt a warmth spread through his chest, a healing he thought lost to the winter's cruel grasp. If you will have me. She smiled, a fragile light breaking across her face for the first time in many seasons. Together, they stepped into the cold morning, leaving behind the village, the gods, and the shadows that had haunted them. The small boat slid silently into the fjord, carrying them toward a future forged not in sacrifice, but in hope. The gods may have turned away, but men still held the power to choose. And in that choice, a new story began to unfold. The early light of dawn seeped through the frost-laced windows of the temple, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The air was thick with the lingering scent of pine resin and smoldering incense, a fragile veil over the turmoil that had gripped the village. Outside, the snow lay heavy and silent, muffling distant footsteps and whispered voices. Inside, the atmosphere teetered between relief and tension, as if the very walls held their breath, waiting for what would come next. Ragnar stood near the altar, a worn but steady presence beside the child who had become the center of a storm far beyond her years. Hilda, small and pale, sat quietly on the cold stone, her gaze steady despite the exhaustion that weighed on her limbs. The mark on her wrist, once a cruel burn of the inverted Algi's rune, had faded to a faint trace, the work of Astrid's slow, deliberate touch. It was a sign not only of mercy but of hope, a fragile promise that the darkness was not absolute. Astrid, the ancient Volva, leaned heavily on her carved wooden staff, her pale eyes reflecting the flickering light with a depth that spoke of lifetimes spent in the service of gods and men alike. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of authority as she addressed those gathered in the temple, a crowd that had grown silent in the wake of recent revelations. The gods do not demand the blood of innocent children, she said, her gaze sweeping across the assembled faces. They test us, yes, but not through the cruelty of sacrifice imposed by mortal hands driven by fear and ambition. Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The men and women who had come to bear witness, warriors, villagers, and elders alike, shifted, the hard lines of suspicion and anger beginning to soften. Among them, Jarl Gunnar's expression was a tight knot of conflict. His green eyes darted between Ragnar and Astrid, grappling with the weight of truth that threatened his authority and the traditions he had upheld without question. Ragnar's gaze never left Hilda's face. The child's eyes, once wide with fear, now held a quiet clarity that belied her years. She was no longer a victim marked for death, but a symbol of a future yet unwritten. A future forged not by the cruel dictates of power or the blind obedience to rights, but by courage and compassion. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint crackle of embers in the temple's hearth. Among the gathered, eyes softened. Some warriors lowered their weapons, grudging respect flickering in their gaze. Among the villagers, a tentative acceptance began to bloom, fragile as the first green shoots beneath the endless snow. Leaf, the blacksmith's son who had stood uncertain moments before, stepped forward, his voice clear. If the gods have indeed turned their faces from us, then it is for men and women to find new ways, to protect, to rebuild, and to honor life rather than sacrifice it. His words carried the weight of youth tempered by wisdom, and others nodded in agreement. The longhouse murmurs of dissent and fear began to give way to cautious hope. Jarl Gunnar's face remained unreadable for a long moment, but finally, the tension in his shoulders eased. With a heavy sigh, he spoke again, this time with a tone that bore the weight of reluctant acceptance. Then we begin anew, not as slaves to fear or blind tradition, but as a people who choose mercy and courage. This child shall live, and with her, we shall find a way forward. Astrid's eyes shone with a quiet pride. The path will not be easy. Old wounds must heal, and old fears must be faced. But the light of truth has pierced the darkness, and that is a beginning. As the crowd began to disperse, the atmosphere shifted from one of confrontation to one of fragile reconciliation. Ragnar remained by Hilda's side, his heart heavy but hopeful. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in many seasons, the weight of despair lessened. Outside, the cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. The distant cries of ravens echoed like a chorus of ancient watchers, bearing witness to a moment where courage had prevailed over cruelty, and mercy had challenged fate. In the quiet that followed, Ragnar allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The past could not be undone. Sigurd's absence was a wound that would never fully heal, but here was a new life, fragile yet fierce, held safely in his arms. The grief that had long shadowed his days now mingled with a tentative joy, a flame rekindled in the cold. Hilda looked up at him, her gray eyes searching and steady. "Will they forgive us?" she asked softly. Ragnar's voice was low but filled with quiet certainty. "They will try, and if they fail, we will show them another way." Her small hand reached up, brushing against his cheek, a silent gesture of trust and belonging. For the first time, a genuine smile touched her lips, fragile but real. Outside the temple, the first rays of the rising sun painted the snow in hues of gold and crimson. The village of Helgavik, scarred but unbroken, breathed beneath a sky that promised a new dawn. The gods may have turned their gaze away, but the wills of men had not faltered. In the heart of the frozen north, amidst shadows of death and despair, a story of redemption and hope had been born. And for Ragnar and Hilda, it was the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of courage, the bonds of chosen family, and the enduring power of mercy in a world forged by steel and spirit. The air was crisp and biting, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke as it whispered through the trees surrounding Helgavik. The village, once cloaked in shadows of suspicion and fear, now moved with a tentative rhythm, a heartbeat softened by the fragile threads of healing. The longhouse, which had witnessed so many storms of blood and words, stood steady against the winter winds, its wooden beams warm with the glow of hearth fires and the muted hum of voices no longer sharpened by anger. Ragnar Thorvaldsson stood near the edge of the harbor, his gaze tracing the frozen fjord where the ice met the gray sky in a bleak, unbroken line. The wind tugged at his red hair and thick cloak, but the chill could not reach the steady warmth that now filled his chest. In his arms, Hilda nestled beneath layers of wool and fur, her small frame no longer marked by the cruel rune that had once seared her skin. The faintest scar remained, a whisper of the past, but it was a wound healing beneath the care of those who dared to protect her. Around them, the village stirred to life in ways that had felt impossible mere moons ago. The fear that had once strangled Helgevik's spirit was giving way to cautious hope. Children played near the frozen stream, their laughter brittle but genuine, while women gathered herbs and mended clothes by the fireside, sharing stories that no longer trembled with the weight of impending doom. The men, once rigid with suspicion and the harsh dictates of tradition, now moved among their kin with softened eyes, their hands less quick to wield blades and more inclined to build, to craft, to nurture. Ragnar's thoughts drifted to the days when the village had been divided by whispers of sacrifice and the dark bargains struck in the name of gods who seemed distant and indifferent. The memory of Eirik Haraldsson's cold ambition and Jarl Gunnar's tight grip on old customs still lingered like a shadow behind the flickering light. But with Eirik's sudden fall and Astrid's steadfast courage, a path had been carved, a path away from fear and toward something new. Hilda shifted in his embrace, her gray eyes rising to meet his. There was a quiet strength there now, a resilience born of survival and the kindness that had dared to defy death itself. Her voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. Do you think they will remember? The ones who wanted me gone. Ragnar looked down, his gaze steady and deep as the fjord. They will remember, and they will learn. It is a part of our story now, the story of what happens when we choose mercy over fear. His hand brushed gently through her dark hair, the touch as tender as the thawing earth beneath the winter snow. A figure approached through the swirling mist. Halvar, the blacksmith, his broad shoulders wrapped in a patched cloak. His face was lined with age and soot, but his eyes held a spark of warmth. The village is changing, he said, voice rough but hopeful. The old wounds won't heal overnight, but the people listen now. They see what courage looks like. Ragnar nodded, grateful for the companionship that had weathered many storms. We have a long road ahead, but this is a beginning. Halvar's gaze drifted toward the flickering glow of the longhouse, where faint sounds of music and laughter spilled into the cold air. Tonight, they celebrate. A feast to honor the turning of the tide, no longer to the gods who demand blood, but to the courage of men and women who choose life. The news traveled quickly through Helgevik. By evening, the longhouse was alive with the murmur of voices and the clatter of wooden cups raised in tentative celebration. Flames danced in the hearth, casting golden light that chased away the winter's gloom. The gathered faces bore the marks of hardship and hope alike, lines softened by forgiveness, eyes brightened by the promise of renewal. Jarl Gunnar Olafsson, once rigid and unyielding, sat among his people with a new weight upon his shoulders. The harshness of his gaze had tempered into contemplation. Beside him, Astrid the Volva stood quietly, her presence a reminder of the ancient wisdom that could coexist with change. She caught Ragnar's eye, nodding in silent acknowledgement, a passing of trust and understanding between the old and the new. Leif, the blacksmith's son, stood near the fire, his youthful optimism a balm in the room. He caught Ragnar's eye and gave a determined smile, a silent vow to stand against the shadows that had once threatened to consume them all. As the feast unfolded, Hilda sat beside Ragnar, her small hand wrapped around the wooden raven amulet still hanging at her neck. The symbol had come to mean more than protection. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest night, guidance could be found. Her smile, faint but real, lit her face with a light that had been long absent. Voices rose in song, a melody both ancient and new, weaving together the past and the promise of tomorrow. Stories of battles and losses were tempered with tales of mercy and courage, the old ways bending to the strength of hearts willing to change. The gods remained silent witnesses, their presence woven into the fabric of the night, as the people of Helgavik embraced a future shaped not by sacrifice, but by the bonds forged in defiance of fear. Later, as the fires burned low and the last song faded into the stillness, as the first light of dawn painted the snow in shades of pale gold, Ragnar and Hilda prepared to depart. The small boat waited silently at the edge of the frozen fjord, its hull creaking gently as if eager to carry them toward the unknown. With provisions gifted by Halvar and blessings whispered quietly by Astrid, they stepped aboard, a man forged by loss, a child reborn through defiance. The oars dipped into the cold water, carrying them away from the village and into the vast expanse of the world beyond. The wind sang low and mournful, but beneath it was a melody of hope. The gods may have turned their gaze away once, but men still held the power to choose their destiny. And in that choice, a new saga began, one written not in blood, but in the quiet strength of humanity's enduring heart. The boat cut steadily through the cold fjord as dawn stretched its pale fingers across the horizon. The water hung still, a glassy mirror reflecting the soft hues of orange and pink that slowly bled into the gray sky. Ragnar's hands gripped the oars with quiet resolve, his breath steady despite the chill that lingered in the air. Beside him, Hilda sat wrapped tightly in furs, the wooden raven amulet resting against her chest like a talisman of hope. The small boat seemed fragile in the vastness of the frozen world, a single vessel carrying two souls bound more by choice than by blood. The village of Helgavik, with its snow-covered rooftops and darkened longhouse, faded slowly into the distance, swallowed by the rising mist and the indifferent sweep of winter's breath. Behind them lay the remnants of a world steeped in fear, sacrifice, and twisted faith. Ahead stretched the unknown, a wilderness where ancient gods no longer dictated the terms of life and death, where men and women might carve their own path with courage and compassion. Ragnar's eyes never left the horizon, but his mind drifted to the weight of what had transpired. The trials of these past days had etched new lines into his weathered face, and yet beneath the scars stirred a quiet awakening. The child beside him, once marked by doom and destined to be lost, was now a beacon, a fragile spark that refused to be extinguished. "Hilda," he said softly, breaking the silence between them. "Do you know why I brought you away from Helgavik?" She looked up, her gray eyes steady and unafraid. "Because the gods turned their backs?" He shook his head slowly. "No, the gods do not always turn their backs. Sometimes they watch and wait, waiting for men to find their own courage, their own mercy." Her small hand brushed against his, tentative but sure. "Will they ever forgive us?" she asked. Ragnar's gaze softened. "Forgiveness is not always for the gods to grant, but for us to give ourselves. The gods may have set the stage, but it is we who write the story." The cold air carried the faintest cry of a raven overhead, a reminder of the silent watchers in the sky. Yet here, in the fragile warmth of this small boat, something new had taken root, something stronger than fear or tradition. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky with golden light, the ice ahead began to thin, the path opening to the promise of spring and renewal. The journey before them was uncertain, filled with risks and unknowns. Yet it was a journey made not in desperation, but in hope, the hope that even in a world shaped by gods and warriors, humanity could reclaim its soul. Ragnar's thoughts turned once more to the village they had left behind. The faces of those who had stood uncertain, torn between old beliefs and new truths. The weight of leadership rested heavily on his shoulders, but he bore it willingly. Protecting Hilda was no longer just an act of defiance. It was a commitment to a future where innocence was not sacrificed on the altar of fear. "Do you want to know what I think?" Hilda's voice was small but clear. He nodded. "I think the gods listen, even if they don't always answer. Sometimes, it's the silence that teaches us the most. And sometimes, it's the choices we make in that silence." Ragnar smiled faintly, a warmth spreading through his chest that winter could never touch. "You speak with the wisdom of one who has seen too much and yet still believes. That is a gift, Hilda. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth, a breath of life in a frozen world. The boat glided forward, the soft splash of oars in water the only sound breaking the stillness. In this quiet moment, beneath the vast expanse of sky and ice, two lives intertwined, one marked by loss, the other by survival, moving together toward a horizon shaped not by gods, but by the indomitable spirit of humankind. Behind them, the village of Helgavik would wake to a new day, its people forever changed by the courage of one man and the resilience of a child. The old ways would linger, as stubborn as the frost, but the seed of change had been sown. It would take root in whispered stories told by firesides, in the cautious glances of those who dared to hope for something different. And somewhere, amidst the shifting shadows of gods and men, the truth settled quietly. Sometimes the greatest sacrifice is not of blood or life, but of fear itself. Ragnar's broad hands rested lightly on the oars as the boat drifted into open water. The future was uncertain, wild as the northern seas, but held within it the promise of something sacred, the courage to protect, the will to endure, and the strength to forge a family not born of blood, but of unyielding love. As the sun climbed toward midday, painting the fjord with shimmering light, Ragnar spoke once more, his voice a low vow against the cold wind. We are not alone, Hilda. The gods may watch, but it is we who choose the path, and together we will walk it. She smiled then, a quiet, genuine smile that shone like a beacon against the endless winter. For the first time, she whispered, I believe in that. The distant cry of ravens echoed softly, their wings tracing invisible patterns across the sky, a reminder that even in silence, there is witness. Even in darkness, there is light. And in the hearts of those who dare to defy fate, the greatest stories are born. If this story has touched you, consider joining us as we delve deeper into the shadows and light of the Viking world. There are more tales waiting, stories of struggle, honor, and humanity beneath the frozen skies. Subscribe, and together, we will uncover the hidden truths of a time when gods and men walked a fragile line between fate and choice. For now, as the boat fades into the horizon, remember this. In the silence between God's ears, it is the courage of the heart that cries loudest. And sometimes, that is enough.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.